Now, some of the other things that you can do with columns in your Power Query editor is, for example, you can move columns. Let's go to the query called Sales by Region. Here we have a list of 11 regions, and these are their sales for the years 2020, 2021, 2022. If I've decided I needed 2022 to be the first column, I'd simply select it and I'd simply drag it. And where that solid line appears is where it will go if I drop. If I simply drag it again to the right, I can drop it back to the right of 2021. So when it comes to moving columns, you can simply drag them. But if you have to move them a distance, then that can be quite tricky. So another thing that you can do is you can go to Transform in your ribbon and you can choose the option to move a column. Now again, if I just widen this a little bit, you'll see that the Move button looks like that. And if I hit the drop down, I can move that column to the left, to the right, to the beginning of this query, or to the end of this query. So if I go to the beginning, it's moved it to the beginning, and then I can move it to the end, and it's reordered the columns. Or I can just delete that step, and it'll put it back to how it was. So I'll just resize this window, and that Move button may end up looking just like that as well, depending on the size of your screen. So there is the ability to move. There's also the ability to sort and filter columns. So for example, I might hit this drop down on region and I can sort ascending or descending, and I can also filter. So if I'm only interested in certain regions such as Taupō, Tauranga and Rotorua, I can then go okay, and instead of seeing 11 rows, I've now filtered out and I'm only seeing 3 rows. This little symbol here tells me that the filter is emanating from that particular column, and this step here also tells me that there are certain rows that have been filtered. So I'm just going to delete that step so I get back to my 11 rows. Now this particular query originated, its original source was a pivot table. So this has come from an Excel sheet and file that was a pivot table, and that's how it's come into here. What if I want to unpivot it? A lot of people don't believe that you can actually do that, but you could unpivot this query and turn it back into its original tabular source. I'm going to select the year 2020, hold the Shift key and select 2022, because those are the columns that I want to unpivot. And so because I want to transform this data, I go to the Transform tab in the actual ribbon. And if I stretch this a little bit, you'll see here, Unpivot Columns. So it's a little button that looks like that. If I hit the drop down, I can unpivot these columns, or unpivot other columns, or unpivot only the selected columns. So I have choices, but I'm just going to go straight on the button to unpivot those columns. And there I have my original tabular list that was the basis of that pivot table to begin with. I could then rename this attribute column, F2, and call it year. I could rename this value column, F2, and call it sales. And so those are my sales by region and by year in a tabular format. So Unpivot is a powerful feature. But also you may notice there's another button here called Pivot, which is if you want to do the inverse. Let's say I want to pivot this data now. I know I could just delete the steps, but let's have a look at that. So for example, what I'll do is I'll click the year, and on the Transform tab in the ribbon, I'll click this Pivot column button. I'll select the fact that I want to make the values sales. And from there, I'll just go OK. And that has therefore created a pivot table. So if you have a pivot table, you can import it into Power Query. And if you wanted to, you could unpivot it. If you don't have a pivot table, you can bring the data into Power Query and proceed to pivot it within Power Query. Very, very powerful. And then I'm just going to delete that step. And I'm just going to hit close and apply. And so I go to home and close and apply. Well, actually, I'm just going to hit apply. So it just applies it to my Power BI.